Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Real Estate Realities with the Rebel Broker. My name is Robert Whitelaw, and I am the Rebel Broker. I am a licensed real estate broker right here in Silicon Valley, California, serving the area from Palo Alto all the way down to Gilroy, and I've been doing this since 1988, over 30 years, serving the needs of buyers and sellers here in the Valley. So if you have any questions, concerns, or you'd like someone to help guide you through the process of buying, selling, or investing in real estate, please feel free to reach out to me. You can find me at soldbyrobert.com. From there, you can start off a home search, or you can start the process to get a immediate value estimate of your home if you're interested in selling. And of course, you can also message me directly from the site. Now, today we have got a subject that I think is going to be critical for anyone who's going to be interested in getting into real estate in terms of purchasing. I want to come at this from the standpoint of buyers and sellers because so much of the news out there is focused exclusively on how this is going to affect real estate agents. And frankly, I don't think anyone cares how it's going to affect real estate agents. I'm not someone who's afraid of change, and I realize this is a big change. But this NAR settlement, the National Association of Realtors, has agreed to a settlement that has not yet been agreed to by the courts. So there may be some pivots in this, which I'll cover in a future show if that happens. But right now, I wanted to give you the lowdown on how this is likely to affect buyers and sellers. And the reason for that is the current proposition is that this is going to happen in the middle of July. So it doesn't happen January of next year. It doesn't happen a year from now. This is right around the corner, just a few months away, and it's going to completely change how folks buy real estate. And it's not all good news. Now, just to sort of lay the groundwork here so you can understand how the system has worked. And when I say how the system has worked, I mean forever. This is not a new challenge. As I mentioned, I've been doing this for over 30 years, and there have been several times in the past where how things are managed in terms of commissions and what the National Association of Realtors can and can't do as it relates to the MLS. These are all things that have been challenged in the past, and it has never resulted in changes in policies. So this is kind of a surprise. I'm not sure what made this different from all of those cases that have happened over the last however many years it's been. I know it's been throughout my entire career, and I know it was decades and decades prior to me coming along. But this is a fundamental change on how real estate is going to happen. And let me sort of lay it out for you. Up until now, when someone wanted to sell their home, they would sign a listing agreement with a broker who, a real estate agent, realtor, however you want to refer to it. But real estate agents and brokers are different animals in terms of how they're licensed. But for the purposes of this discussion, we don't need to get into those differences. A listing agreement would be signed. And in that listing agreement, there would be very clear discussions about the fact that commissions are negotiable and that a certain amount will be paid to the broker to sell the home, and then some part of whatever that broker is being paid will then be offered to the agent that brings a buyer to the transaction. The argument over the years has been sellers shouldn't be paying the buyer's agent because that's paying the opposition, or it changed who by who was paying, the fiduciary responsibility was affected. I never looked at it that way. I looked at it as an amount that the seller was paying to the broker, and then the broker simply took those funds and used them to then compensate the buyer's agent. So the buyer's agent wasn't being paid by the seller, it was being paid by the broker. But my opinion on that one actually doesn't matter at this point, because we are where we are, and this is the change that's going to happen. This is sort of the absolutely foundational changes that are about to happen, which are most dramatically going to affect buyers. So let's go ahead and jump in. Now, what we're going to hit are two things. I'm going to sort of lay out some of the bullet points of what's changed, and then we're going to go into what I have sort of been trolling the internet for questions that buyers have and sellers have relating to this, and hopefully offer some answers and some insights given my experience at this, which again is a very long time, and how I believe this might play out. And we can even play a little game to figure out what might really be behind this. I know that one of my listeners and friend to the show, Scott Blasius, who's a real estate agent up in Sacramento, California, he sees some, I don't want to say conspiracy theory stuff, but I don't think he's entirely wrong, right? When you follow the money, you realize that there are folks behind this that are seeing opportunities to bleed buyers for money that previously was more difficult for them to do because of the way the system runs, right? And all of these various players, whether it's Zillow or Trulia or mortgage people or whatever, have been wanting to get more into being able to get into the real estate services part of the equation. And they've had like the e-buyer scenarios, right? Where you could do sort of virtual buyers agents, that sort of thing, and have been dramatic failures. So this might be something that's been simply supported by that. But again, I don't think that matters as much as where we are going to end up in terms of how buyers and sellers are working through the process of getting their homes sold. Overall, I am someone who agrees with more options and more freedom. I also have not always agreed with some of the things that are managed through the MLS and by the Association of Realtors, and thought that there should be some changes. However, I don't think anyone who actually has the interests of the consumers would have landed on this set of solutions. And we can get into that. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And as you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Now, there is going to be a coffee and real estate live chat this month in April. We are going to be doing that on Sunday instead of Saturday this month. One of my boys is graduating from college on that day, so I would like to attend that. So what we're going to do is have the coffee and real estate on Sunday, April 21st at 10 a.m. So that'll be a live chat. It'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions. I'm going to cover much of this during that in a live format so people can ask questions. So feel free to show up to that. And again, you can get information on that at soldbyrobert.com. You can also find it on my Facebook page. You can also find it on my YouTube page. So just be looking for that, because I think it'd be a great place for us to have a live conversation about what we're facing here with these changes. So let's go ahead and hit some of the bullet points here, and then we'll get into the questions. Now, first, current commission practices can still be used as long as it is off the MLS. Right now in the MLS, when a real estate agent is searching for homes on behalf of a buyer, one of the fields tells them how much do you get paid when escrow closes, and it's usually a percentage, anything from 2 usually to 3%. Sometimes it's more. It depends on the property. It depends on the circumstances, but usually it's somewhere in that range. Whatever has been negotiated, it's what the seller's agent is offering to the buyer's agent for whatever buyer they bring to the transaction. After the middle of July, you will not be allowed to include that information in the multiple listing service. I don't think that's a good move. Whatever compensation is going to be offered by the listing agent should be communicated in the listing on the MLS. Blocking that, I guess, is satisfying some sort of funky thing relating to the lawsuit and settlement. But what's interesting is what the listing agent can communicate is seller, quote unquote, concessions that they can then enter into the multiple listing service. Now, whenever you have a scenario where you're going to continue to communicate something, but you have to use different terms in how you describe it, I am always super suspicious of that kind of thing. It speaks to a lack of understanding of what's happening. And when you need to circumvent things by changing the terminology, I'm just always very suspicious of that. So what that basically is going to equal is in the private comments of a listing, and the private comments of a listing mean only other real estate agents can see it. It'll simply say, seller willing to offer a 2% concession to buyer. Right? So it's a way of continuing the same process we've always used, but it's a concession to be aimed at buyers' closing costs. You can't say that is designed to pay your buyer's agent, but that's what it's there for. clearly, right? Buyer's agent, and so much of this impacts buyers more than sellers, and we're going to talk more about that. But buyer's agents now, before you as a buyer can be shown a home by a real estate agent, you are going to have to sign a buyer broker agreement before a property can be shown. So this is obviously a new obstacle that's going to have to be put in the way of agents being able to show homes. An example you might think of is, let's say you are a buyer and you are at an open house and you're looking at the home and you get into a conversation with the real estate agent who's holding the home open, and they bring up 2 or 3 other homes that you hadn't seen and you like them and you want to go see them as soon as possible, like today. Just so happens that that agent's open house is about to end in a half hour. Well, before that agent can take you to see those homes, you need to sign a buyer broker agreement. And in that, it's going to define how that buyer agent is compensated if you end up buying a home. So we're going to get into that a little bit too. There are a variety of ways that a buyer's agent can now be compensated, because one thing that's going to be a reality here is there are going to be some agents that list a home that provide no compensation to buyer's agents at all. So that'll be up to the buyer's agent to get worked out with the buyer. That compensation can take the form of a fixed fee commission to be paid by the buyer. It could be a concession from the seller, as we've already discussed. It could be a portion of the listing broker's compensation. And as I mentioned, these are things that will go into effect in mid-July of 2024, so not that far out. Now, all of this that we're going to discuss today is subject to court approval, but the general take out on the internet seems to be that this is going to be approved. Or if it is not approved, it will ultimately be approved with minor changes. And again, I'll cover those as those come up, but I want to prepare you mentally for this because there are an awful lot of things this affects. And also, the speed with which this is happening, I think is going to cause a great deal of chaos for buyers. I am personally, in my approach, going to suggest to my sellers that they continue to have a concession that will be aimed at compensating a buyer's agent, simply because whenever uncertainty comes, anything that is comforting or gets as close to the quote unquote norm that's been accepted for a long time is going to tend to have better outcomes, meaning more attention, more willingness for folks to make offers, that type of thing. So let's jump into it. Will this help buyers better qualify for buying a home? So you're a buyer, you want to buy a home. Whatever you are looking at in terms of price range, you suddenly have a new expense added to your list of expenses, and that is compensating a buyer's agent potentially. Because when you sign that buyer broker agreement, there is no guarantee that if you make let's say that you find homes, and some homes are going to have that willingness to upfront pay a concession to closing costs for you. That's great. But let's say in your agreement with your buyer broker, they say, I want 1.5%, or I want 2%, or I want 3%, and you agree to whatever that number is. If the number that's offered by the seller is equal to what has already been defined by the seller's agreement, or by your buyer broker agreement, then great. Then that closing cost is covered by the concession. But let's say it's not. Let's say you've agreed to 3% or 2%, and the seller is only willing to offer a concession of 1%. So you're still on the hook for 1% in terms of additional closing costs on your end, which would then get rolled into your loan, which could potentially cause problems because it depends on how much your home appraises for, right? Your lender is not necessarily going to be willing to cover that. If you're a veteran, I think that there is going to be a need for an awful lot of lenders to change their policies on lending so that it is easier to roll these fees into your loan, because it's simply not going to be approved. You're going to find that these things are going to be disallowed, not covered, that they will not allow you as the buyer to pay some of these fees. Now, VA specifically says you can't pay realtor fees. And I'm thinking at some point a check gets written for your buyer's agent through the escrow as a closing cost. So it seems to me that would meet the criteria of something that your VA wouldn't cover. So it doesn't improve your ability to qualify for a home. I don't think any lenders on the planet are yet prepared to manage what will likely happen as a result of this. So what does that do? Well, it potentially reduces what you can afford by that 2% or that 1% or that 1.5% or the 3%, whatever you agree. Now, what's also interesting is, and we're gonna let me jump to this question because I thought this was very interesting. Does this change mean that buyers can make an offer without using a buyer's agent? Now, that's a yes or no question. And this is what the National Association of Realtors says in answer to this question. Quote, as always, the consumer chooses whether to use a real estate professional. Research has confirmed that consumers find great value in the services provided by a buyer broker. And we continue to believe it is imperative for buyer brokers to clearly articulate what services and value they are providing to consumers. Translation, in my mind, is yes. A buyer can make an offer without using a buyer's agent, which introduces all kinds of complications. Now, obviously, the seller's agent owes a fiduciary responsibility to the seller. But as someone who has been doing this for a very long time, even when I'm dealing with a buyer's agent on the other side, I frequently find that things they are supposed to do, they do not do. And then you start having this scenario of where, well, these folks have no clue what they're doing. You can send them documents that they're supposed to sign, but if they've chosen to make an offer without the benefit of an agent, and I'll tell you what, as a real estate agent who does lots of listing, I will absolutely be asking that buyer to sign a piece of paper that says, I am not your agent. And there's a standard form that exists for that. I do not represent you. I have no fiduciary responsibility to you. And so they're expected to simply be able to understand what these documents mean, what their response should be to it, and to act accordingly. And to do things on time. And to understand when they are sent a notice that to perform or quit, for instance, and that's a term relating to you haven't done what you said you would do on time. So now either do what you were supposed to do on time, or we're gonna close this escrow. We're gonna cancel the escrow. Getting buyers to understand that requires explanations. That if I start offering explanations to the buyers when they're not represented, what does that do to me in terms of my risk? There's a thing called color of authority. If you act in a way that implies that you are someone's representative or their fiduciary, you will be held responsible in the future if something bad comes out of that. So in other words, in order to protect themselves, sellers' agents will not be able to give any advice of any kind or prompting to buyers who come into the transaction unrepresented by a real estate agent. The bad news is this is the worst case scenario for buyers. Any buyer that comes into purchasing a home without representation, I think is making a huge mistake. This is the biggest purchase of your life. You need the expertise of someone to come in and not only help you navigate the paperwork that's required, but also know when to key off of specific information to get more data, right? So during that, whatever it is, 2-week period of discovery, when you make an offer on a home that's been accepted as a buyer, you're supposed to know what you're supposed to do your research, to do your due diligence, to know that the home is in a condition that you completely understand. There's no requirement that the seller's agent gives you a home inspection or a termite report or anything else. So suddenly, that's all up to you. And you need to understand how those things are important to you and what implications they have and what those reports should tell you when you read them. So I'm very concerned about what's going to happen with buyers and representation, because this is the bubble in which buyers are going to get hosed. And it's going to range all the way from buyers who decided not to work with an agent at all to represent them, all the way up to ones who have done a full boat, 2%, whatever, hiring of an agent to represent their interests. And I refer to this as the bubble of opportunity, because this is where all these folks are going to rush in and offer services to buyers. I could see this is the e-buyer thing that I think so many organizations are interested in exploiting. And the sad news is the kind of representation you're going to get offered is going to be low bar cost. It'll be a flat fee. Many of them won't offer. They'll offer it, but the difference in service may not be what you would hope. Instead of having you pay a percentage, maybe it's a flat fee, and then you are expected to be well represented by that agent. Just to calibrate you, that's not going to happen. And the reason I say that is no one who is getting paid a very small amount of money, and this will be, it's not going to surprise me if this is almost all virtual, right? You will be expected to view homes on your own. You won't have an agent who is helping you find homes, helping you navigate through their understanding of the local market, how these areas meet the needs that you have. So none of the local expert knowledge will be available to you, but you'll be drawn to these solutions because of the low cost, at least the low upfront cost. My argument would be that the payoff is going to come later, when agents potentially save you from either carrying out a purchase that you really shouldn't have, or an agent who gets you the protections that even after the escrow closes gives you a window of opportunity to get compensation if anything wasn't disclosed by the seller adequately, or something that was disclosed and you simply didn't know how to properly react to it. In my opinion, these folks you're going to spend money on that are just going to be some flat fee, are all they're going to do is review the paperwork. I don't think you're going to get a lot of intelligent feedback. I think a lot of it is going to be boilerplate, and it's going to have to be, because by the nature of this service, it's going to be high volume, low touch. They're not going to spend time. They're probably, in fact, it wouldn't surprise me if they rely on an AI to review the documents that come through to decide whatever's going to happen, right? It is the lowest level of service and attention that any buyer could get, and that's what a lot of buyers are going to be drawn to when it comes right down to it. So this is not, in relation to this particular question, a good thing for buyers. And I think the bad news is it's going to take 18 months for a lot of this stuff to shake out. And I think in that time, horrible things are going to be happening to buyers. And the potential for lawsuits down the road in terms of buyers wanting to sue somebody, I think is going to skyrocket. I think we're potentially going to see some very, very interesting cases coming up for buyers that said, hey, I didn't know this. I can't be expected to know any of these things. I'm not a real estate expert. I'm not a licensed real estate agent. Someone should have told me this. But it couldn't be the seller's agent. The seller's agent cannot start giving you advice without assuming that position as your agent through their actions, right? The color of authority. They cannot do something that then gives them color of authority over your actions in the real estate transaction for this very reason, right? The other option is dual agency. Now, for those of you who've been listening to my show for a while, and I've been doing this since 2007, I am not a fan of dual agency. California is a dual agency state. It is absolutely legal for one agent to represent both buyers and sellers. That's what's going to happen in a lot of these cases. And I'm going to argue that while it's better than the options we just discussed, it still gives you a scenario where you have one person who is supposed to be knowledgeable about what both parties want most and least, and somehow navigate this middle ground where they're not disclosing confidential things to the seller about the buyer or to the buyer about the seller. So there's that new element. Imagine the lawsuits that will come out of these dual agency things that I think will definitely take an uptick in this new reality. Next, will this make getting adequate advice and guidance for buyers easier or harder or better? So we've kind of already discussed that. I think that you'll have tons of options of various kinds, but the bottom line is it will still cost you something in many cases. I'm not sure I'd describe it as easier because prior to this, it just happened automatically. You never had to worry about how your buyer's agent was being paid. It just happened. It was just a fee that the seller's agent was paying to the buyer's agent. And will it be better? No. In broad strokes, on average, what the buyers get will not be better unless, because I can see a whole segment of buyer's agents that will simply not work with buyers unless they are getting compensation that is at least in a range that is comparable to what they were getting before, which means that a buyer ahead of time has to commit to a certain compensation level that may or may not end up being something that gets covered by concessions from the seller. And of course, buyer's agents can write an offer. If the seller doesn't offer any concessions up front, the buyer's agent can write into the contract that the seller will contribute 2% to buyer's closing costs, which would theoretically cover this, right? Doesn't mean the buyer has to, or the seller has to accept it. And in addition to that, with the current market, do you think that agents and sellers are going to reject offers based on those requests? Yeah. Because remember, this isn't an invisible thing. This isn't something now that's just happening between the agents. This is now the seller seeing another amount of money being taken out of the equation for them. So the seller's agents and the sellers themselves are very vested in keeping as much money as possible. So again, another negative for buyers in terms of them having a potential condition on a contract, an offer they're making on a home that makes their offer less attractive. So those who are at the lower end of the purchasing spectrum, who have less cash to come into the deal with, are going to be hurt even more. They're going to be hurt disproportionately by this. Or they have to seek out what I personally categorize as substandard representation. Now, there will be all kinds of forms that the void that's going to be filled by all this craziness, and there will be tons of craziness when it starts. The void that they come in to fill is going to be filled with folks that are going to have tons of disclosures for you to sign as a buyer that will completely leave them unsuable if something horrible happens to you. So just keep that in mind as well. Next. Will this save sellers money? Well, clearly, right? Now sellers will only be paying 3% or 2% or 2.5% instead of 5.5%, 6%, 7%, whatever. I mean, I've listed homes at higher than 6%. So it simply is a fee that the seller's agent and the seller no longer need to take in consideration if they don't want to. Now, again, for folks who want to get their home sold quickly and for the most, I think offering some sort of concession to the buyer's agent is going to be a critical part of that. So just keep that in mind. If you're an agent listening to this, just keep that in mind. Just because the craziness that's going to ensue is going to make it very difficult for a lot of these transactions to happen in a way that's going to give you what you're looking for. Next, will this settlement lower home prices? And this was almost the first one I put on this because in terms of what's being disseminated out there by whatever random talking heads are out there talking about home prices, this is one of their things. Hey, one great thing about this is it's going to lower home prices. No, it is not going to lower home prices. What planet do you live on? What are the things right now? I mean, even if we just look at how things are right now, let's say universally, somehow it became normal for all homes to only be sold where 1% goes to the listing agent and 1% goes to the buying agent, right? Let's pretend that. And suddenly all of the agreements are around 2% total, 1% to one half, 1% to the other. Would that change the asking price of the home? No, because there's nowhere in the equation of what your home is worth in the marketplace that takes into account that number. If someone lists a home at 6% today versus and let's say instead of 6% they do 4.5%, does that mean the home is going to be 1.5% cheaper? No, of course not. Because again, that's not part of the equation that defines what a home's value is on the market. Supply and demand defines that. That percentage depends on the value of the home, not the other way around. So anyone who's out there and there are CNN, MSNBC, NBC, ABC, all the big alphabet soup news agencies, one of the comments they make is that their expert real estate person tells everybody, yeah, this is going to reduce home prices. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. It will increase the cost to buyers and therefore potentially change or shift the bracket of home prices some people are shopping in, but it's not. So it may reduce the demand at some higher price points, but in my market, I'm willing to bet we do not see any change that relates to this in terms of home prices. Now, there are market forces, actual real market forces in play right now that are reducing home prices in some areas, but this isn't going to have any effect on it. Homes sell for what buyers are willing to pay for it. And it's that simple. It has nothing to do with anything else. And all this does is potentially increases the overall cost that a buyer has to bear, which may in fact affect how much they're willing to spend and likely would. And as lenders become more in tune with this reality, I have no doubt this is going to affect how you get compensated or how you get your loan, right? How much you get approved for, because now there's an additional expense in the mix that wasn't there before. So all of these lenders need to figure out what their policy is going to be on that. And that hasn't been decided. And there's no telling how long it's going to take them to come up with those decisions. I have not seen a single posting anywhere from any lender that talks about what their policies are going to be once this is in place. And because stupid is everywhere, I think that it's not going to start getting discussed until those first transactions come along where this is a thing, where this is a problem. And now banks have to decide as they review the escrow documents, well, you know, there's this fee that you're paying. We think that's a bad thing. Now, it could, for many buyers, the ones who are more financially qualified, it's simply going to be an issue of bringing more money to the table, right? But think of the loans and the number of loans that are drawn that where the folks are bringing very little money to the game, 1%, 0.5%, in some cases 0%. Folks who can only buy a home using those mechanisms are not going to be able to pay 1, 1.5%, 2% to a buyer's agent to represent them adequately in this transaction. So they may end up going with those flat fee folks that are going to be a escrow mill. You're not going to have an agent who's focusing primarily on your transaction and giving it the attention it deserves. You're going to have one agent with 100 other people all at the same time where you're simply being pushed through a automated process. There is not going to be any individual intelligence applied to this. And the only quote unquote intelligence you're going to get is going to be from whatever AI they have in position to review these documents. No negotiation skills are going to be brought to bear for you, which is a crucial definer of how much money you save on your purchase. And that's just not going to happen for you. Those skills won't be there. Anybody who had those negotiation skills is not going to be sitting at a desk in a high rise in San Francisco dealing with 50 escrows a day, just trying to push the paperwork through. Not going to happen. Next, does this affect how useful it is to use a real estate agent that is a realtor? I think that's an excellent question. The importance of the MLS, the differentiating of being a realtor. There's now no longer requirement to be in the MLS with a lot of these standards. What's going to be the value add? This is really more of a real estate agent focused question, but I hope that the Association of Realtors sees this as an opportunity to actually make being a realtor have a very defined value, because I think there's areas where they can definitely improve. Next, how will this affect buyers' ability to get financing? I think it'll negatively affect it. We kind of already touched on that. I think it's going to become more difficult. I think you're going to qualify for lower loan amounts based on this reality. But first, banks have to grok the idea that they need to be willing to roll these expenses into your mortgage. I think that's the only way this happens. But overall, I am worried for buyers. I think that this is a scenario where we may see a great deal of chaos for a year to a year and a half, where things may end up working out at the end and being just as beneficial for buyers as in the past. But the current environment that we will be in when these are put into effect will have buyers in a far less safe position than they were before. In fact, even a scenario where they would be not only less safe, but dramatically so, to the point where they could find themselves having purchased a home that, if they had had adequate representation, would have cost them less, or issues that were found would have been found and dealt with prior to them buying it that they're now stuck with after the purchase. So they could end up with a home they've paid more for, and now they have to save money to fix problems they find after the home's been purchased, where under adequate representation, a lower price would have been negotiated, and during the escrow process, as issues were found, more negotiations would have occurred to reduce the sales price to compensate the buyer for any shortcomings in the property, or potentially even had those issues dealt with prior to close of escrow. So look for chaos. That this is a horrible thing for buyers in the short term. And I think everyone needs to be very aware of where their best interests lie. Buyers, you need some sort of representation. I'm going to strongly suggest that you not represent yourself. I realize you may think that this is not a super complicated thing. It shouldn't be a super complicated thing. And maybe you'll be able to do that. Maybe you'll find yourself making a purchase where that's not a problem, and you end up lucking out, and you come out of the process having not had to pay a buyer agent, and everything's fine. But I honestly think that the incidence of downside for you as a buyer is far more likely than that scenario, to some degree or another. To a minor of, wow, I really wish I'd realized that this leak issue was dealt with, or boy, now that I'm looking at what other homes have sold for, I feel like I overpaid for this house, right? That's the minor side. All the way up to, wow, now we've discovered the foundation needs $25,000 worth of work. These are all things where an experienced agent who's acting as your buyer representative would catch, or at least suggest more inspections to potentially reveal any of those problems. Experienced real estate agents get so much experience, and even may not be able to say, oh, well, that's a foundation problem that is X, Y, and Z, but they're able to identify clues to these problems, whether it's an uneven floor or it's a basement where there's a crack in a specific location that concerns them about the stability of the foundation, right? Or a patch in the foundation that looks like it wasn't actually a structurally sound update to the foundation, just so that they know the right questions to ask. One of the best things an experienced real estate agent brings to a buyer is simply understanding these are questions we should ask based on what we've seen, or based on the inspections we've had. What additional questions should we ask? What other professionals should we bring in to look at this based on what we're seeing in these reports? So there you have it. Those are sort of the long and short of it in terms of the most relevant questions I saw bouncing around out there. Overall, it makes the process for buyers much more of a minefield than previously. So I hope the folks out there who are interested in buying are going to carefully figure out how they're going to navigate their buying experience. The one suggestion I'm just absolutely going to make is do not do this yourself. Do not do nothing, or do not do everything yourself. Or get super educated. Spend a few months getting super educated, at least on the basics. I'm very worried about what's going to happen. And I see a whole bunch of lawsuits coming up within 2 years after this happening, this being done, particularly in that chaos period where everyone's still trying to work out what's the best way for this to work, because I don't think they've figured it out yet. I don't think the right way for this to work is in any way represented in what is going to happen in the middle of July. I think that's going to be something that's going to be discovered through trial and error over the next year. And I'll tell you what, in a market that is like the one we're in now, having this kind of thing happen at this time is a very bad thing for everybody involved. And the people who are going to come out of this the best are going to be sellers, and it's going to be buyers who have strong financial support for their purchase, and the ability to get the representation that they deserve. I'm very concerned about folks on the lower end of the spectrum who are going to see this as yet another expense they don't feel like they can manage, and embracing something that is going to give them a sense of comfort and safety that simply is not warranted given what they're actually getting. All right, folks. I hope that's valuable for everyone. I know it's a long one today. I thought this one would probably go long as we creep up on 43 minutes for today's podcast, but I hope it's valuable for you. If you've got any questions about it, feel free to reach out to me. Again, you can find me at soldbyrobert.com. And as I said at the outset, the goal here is to leave you with more knowledge on the table than we take up in your time. I feel like we've done that. I feel like we've hit an awful lot of the check marks on this particular subject, and I hope it's been valuable for you. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I do appreciate you taking the time to listen to what I have to say on these subjects. Thanks again for listening. I will talk to you all next time.